Remember that time I told you that last week would be the end of the miracle lessons? Just kidding. All right. It will be tonight instead. Yes, Jimmy, I was not necessarily thinking of you when I put the scripture reading out there, but when I saw you stuff up there, and I thought, oh, I said he's earned it. That day he read 9 chapters of Deuteronomy. There, I tell you what, it was nobody needed the reward more than Jimmy. So I'm glad for that. Tonight we are finishing our study on the miracles. Now I've kind of got a couple of different things, a little bit of a review, but also a little bit of a look. It's hard to say this, look forward, look backwards. I don't know what the best way to approach it is, but the cessation of miracles, where miracles stopped. And we're not going to spend a great deal of time on that because that gets into that gets a little beyond the scope of maybe what we're trying to cover with this. And I do want to sort of wrap things up, but it's a bit of a review, but also a bit of maybe an ending of a period in Bible history. In maybe we would say a turning of the page to something in the future. And so tonight we're going to look at a couple of different things. I don't have a specific scripture. In the past we've always said, we're going to be a Matthew, we're going to be a Mark. We have a few that we're going to look at. I think everything will be up on the screen for you. There'll be some others that are referenced, and you're more than welcome to turn and look at them. But just to review for this, a couple of things. First of all, the nature of these miracles. And there are 4 words in the Bible, in the New Testament, that denote the miraculous work of Jesus. And we'll look at all of those here in just a second. These words sort of overlap in usage, but they carry a little bit of nuance as well. And so some of them will mean slightly different things. I'm not expecting you to be familiar with the Greek necessarily up here, but I do want you to see that there are different words that are used, and they may have some slightly different meanings. The first one here is terrace, and Boo, you can tell me if I get them wrong on this. I think there's one I'm a little worried about, but terrace, and it's translated as wonder. And in Acts chapter 2 and verse 22, this is the word that Peter uses in his sermon when he's telling all that Jesus had done. So if you look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 22, the word translated there, he says, "Men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know." And so this is Peter preaching after Jesus has died, buried, resurrected, and gone. But he's saying, this man that you remember him walking around the community, walking around the neighbors. Remember all of those things that he was doing. This is the word that Peter uses. He uses the word terrace, but it's wonder. And I would imagine, and I think we can think about this word, would wonder, W-O-N-D-E-R, be a fitting term for miracles? Why does that word in the English seem to match with our concept of miracles? Okay. Yes. How many of you have tried to wrap your head around the miracles of Jesus, but kind of struggled with that? Why do we struggle with that? So then let me ask you this. How many of you have ever said something along the lines of, I wonder what they meant by that? We all use that term all the time, right? Well, we're kind of wondering a little bit like, I know the Bible says it, and it tells the story, but I can't really relate it to anything. If I see you attempt to dunk a basketball, well, you're going to fail at it, but I've seen people that could do it, but I can't relate to this. And so that word wonder works right there. The second word is dunamis. All right. And so this word is translated as mighty works or as powers. Luke chapter 4 and verse 36. This is when Jesus, this is the word that was used when Jesus cast out an unclean spirit. Okay? So when Jesus cast out an unclean spirit. Why does the word mighty works or powers work when describing a miracle? You can't do it. So a mighty work, I can do a work, but then if you do a mighty work, it feels like you've done a lot more than what I did, right? And so when somebody casts an unclean spirit out of a person, I don't really understand that, right? That's a little hard to grasp. But I would know and I believe that it would take some might and some power to be able to do that. Probably something that I don't have and you don't have, right? So when we think about these words, we think about the word wonder, we think about the word mighty works or power. Each of these words seems to put Jesus where compared to me and you? Way above, right? And so it's establishing just with some vocabulary that we pale in comparison to Christ. Okay. What about the third one? This is probably the one word in here that you may be somewhat familiar with. But paradoxus is translated a strange thing. Okay. This is from Luke chapter 5 and verse 26 when Jesus healed a paralyzed man. So it's a paradox is a contradictory act, something that doesn't really make sense. And so if you see a man paralyzed and then you see that man walking, that doesn't make sense, right? Because I know when you're paralyzed, you can't what? What can you not do? You can't walk, but now you're walking. So we have flipped the script almost, right? And so this is what the word is used there. It's still a miracle, but it is a paradox, a strange thing. How many of you have started a sentence or started a story by saying something along the lines, I saw the strangest thing today? Why do you start a story that way? It's you got to tell somebody, right, Linda? Like, I don't know. I don't really know what I saw, but I saw something. Well, if you saw a man paralyzed and then a little later that afternoon, he's up walking and dancing and whatever, what are you going to start your story like when you go home at night? you all those we use the same vocabulary today, right? We still, even the things that, and a lot of times you're not going to believe this, and then it's not even that good of a story. But if you saw somebody that was paralyzed and then walking, that's something else. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. And almost all of these cases where people, especially people that had the inability to walk or something like that, the Bible talks about them has been in that state for a long time. Some of them had been in that state since birth. It's not like if, they've been sick for a couple of days and now they're up and better. Well, we can relate to that, but this is something that would be hard for us to grasp. Then the fourth word, this is Simeon, Semeion. I wasn't sure about that one, but it translates simply to sign. And this is what Jimmy was reading there just a few moments ago. But it refers to miracles that points to an underlying sort of spiritual truth. And we've talked about this, and Jimmy read it just a second ago. What was the purpose of the miracles? To confirm. Ultimately, they were a teaching tool. And yes, you walked away sort of wondering what you'd seen. Yes, you walked away seeing things that had sort of flipped. Yes, you saw power that you'd never seen before. But the ultimate goal was for you to walk away and say, what about Jesus? All right, this is the guy. This is truly the Son of God. And that's what Jimmy read there in John 20 a few minutes ago. And that's what we see with there. So those are the nature of it. Thoughts on this before we go into the next thing? You don't know what the next thing is, so you don't know what to say right now, do you? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Right. Right. But we fail with language quite often, and we struggle to describe things. And in the heat of things, when you've just left the game and you've just seen a person heave a shot, all the way down the floor. I mean, how do you describe that to somebody? Well, you started by saying, "I saw the strangest thing," right? It was a miracle. The language sometimes fails us on that. Now, as we've talked about over the course of these 30 some odd lessons that we've looked at, a few characteristics of it. We had miracles in which that prove that Jesus had power over physical illness. Can you think of any where Jesus healed people's physical illness? Peter's mother-in-law, the deaf mute, the lepers, all sorts. I think there's like 17 or something that in some way or shape or form dealt with physical illness. Why would somebody suffering from a physical illness have been appreciative of a miracle? Change their life, right? Absolutely so. Why else? Why else would a person struggling or dealing with some kind of physical illness have been appreciative? Yeah, right. Right.
The lady with the issue of blood had spent all of her living
with
doctors and just wasted all her money, and she was not a bit better.
Right.
And this is a dead-end road for her.
Absolutely. And so there's numerous examples, and you can list, you can probably think of more along the way. There were several that were mentioned, I think something like 9 or so, that dealt with nature in some way. Can you think of any examples of how miracles that involved nature that we've studied? Jesus calming the winds, the fig tree, walking on the water. So those are not things necessarily that happened to somebody in the sense of like you were healed, but how would a miracle dealing with nature, how would that have affected you if you'd seen something like that?
If you'd been in the boat and it was sinking, you woke him up and he stopped it.
Absolutely. What'd you say? Linda said, I probably would have passed out if I'd seen something like that. We can probably all relate to that there as well. Catching the fish, okay? And so we have all of these kinds of things would have been, that's unnatural, right? These are the kind of things that you don't see. You can go out there tonight and say, stop being cold or stop being windy. Is it going to work? I mean, people might look at you, they might be wondering at the strange things that you are, but you're not going to get a whole lot accomplished right there. But that's another type of miracle that we see. A third one that we see was there were instances of demon possession. And perhaps this is the one that we struggle with maybe sort of grasping the most because it's such an odd situation, perhaps. But obviously somebody who had dealt with demon possession would have appreciated that. I didn't ask this question, and I wanted to ask this question, and I thought about this over the last, it's kind of preparing for this. How grateful do you think the families of the people that had been demon possessed were? Be hard to describe, right? And they really have anything to do with it, but they would have benefited greatly from this. It would be hard to grasp, right? Of course. And the fact that you couldn't do anything about it, but yet, you want to try and help and you want to try and fix it, but you can't. I thought about that as we was kind of getting this ready. The other one here, we see examples of resurrections from the dead even as well. And so all sorts of different characteristics that made up these miracles that we have. Lots of different ones. There's a couple other things that you can see. I don't know if that shows up very well, but the miracles of Jesus had many witnesses. And we've seen in these lessons, there were times when there were just a handful of people around, but there were times the Bible uses the word multitude, right? And so I don't know what a handful is and a multitude is in your head, but every time these miracles take place, there's people there, right? And there's different people. And there's probably sometimes when there was more men, or maybe there was times there was more women. And there might have been times that there were more older people and there were more younger people, perhaps. Who knows what the situation was? But these situations go to our second bullet point up there, which made it undeniable. Because you're going to go out and do what when you see this? Tell it. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so we don't even know, a percentage of what Jesus had actually done. But we see it quite often that Jesus would tell the person that he had done the miracle to not to go tell. But it's really hard to tell a multitude of people not to go tell something that you just saw, right? It's hard to keep all of them. And so, we've had this conversation in here before, but obviously seeing something like that, you're probably going to go tell what you have seen. Well, yeah. Why is that guy walking? He didn't used to be able to walk. Why is he walking? Yeah.
I think the miracle really laid some of the foundation stones for the church to come, because they didn't understand, they were confused. But then all of a sudden, Jesus dies, he's resurrected, the church is established, and then people start talking about this.
Right.
Start spreading that. And it just went ablaze.
Sure.
Because people said, I saw that guy.
Sure.
I ate there that day. And I think, yes, this is exactly what's the Messiah.
Absolutely.
And then, like the people that had a miracle done for them, it was never necessary for their benefit. It was
Right.
for the benefit of the confirmation of who Jesus was, and sort of like it was a good help for them.
Sure.
But it was really for everybody. It was for everybody's benefit in the long run.
So then let's go on to the next thing then, which was the purposes of, because I think that's what you're hitting on there just a little bit. The first thing that we see here, the first purpose was to prove the identity of Jesus, right? To show who Jesus was. And you can see that in John chapter 3, chapter 7, John chapter 20, what Jimmy read there a few moments ago as well. But all of that is to prove his identity. Do you think at some point in one of these or multiple of these miracles, somebody was like, beside somebody else, is like, did the whole elbow thing, like, who's this guy? You think that sentence was ever said? And then they probably said, I don't know. Maybe they did turn around and say, it's Jesus. But they might have turned around and said, I don't know. And so then you're looking in, it's like, who's this guy? Who's this guy? All of a sudden, it's Jesus. It's Jesus. He was that guy that did this or that. That identity was proven by the miracles. Number two, it was to prove then, perhaps more importantly, his authority. What is authority? Having power, all right? And there's all kinds of levels of authority, right? Your boss at work has authority over you. Do they sometimes flex that a little too much? Of course. Do they always deserve that authority that maybe they've got? Maybe not, right? Probably, Jimmy, the definitive no from Jimmy right there. Remember, these are recorded and shown on TV, Jimmy. So I don't want to get you fired because of something you said. But proving authority is sometimes the person in authority is like, I have the power, I have the power, I have the power. And they want you to know that. Do we see that, though, with Jesus? It was more of a sort of latent approval of authority. How did Jesus prove his authority? Through his word, right? Through his works, through what he was doing right there. If you look at Mark chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, this is when Jesus had forgiven and heals the paralyzed man. But in verses, make sure I got the right ones too. Mark 2, verses 10 and 11, but that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. And he said that to the paralytic. And then he said to you, I say to you, arise, take up your bed, and go to your house. And so in two sentences right there, Jesus says, I am here to prove what I can do, and then lift up and ease on out to your house right now. And so Jesus didn't have to say, in a few minutes, in a couple weeks, in a couple months, you'll probably be able to limber them legs up a little. It wasn't like that, right? He said, go do it right now. Well, some people can talk all day about authority, and some people can show it. What was Jesus, talking or showing? Absolutely. Purpose number 3 was also to show compassion. Why is compassion important.
It almost puts that person on the same level.
Mm-hmm.
I know before she got healed, the confession that I had 15 years ago, still have to this day.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never, ever forget things people did, said,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
because they're putting it down on your level.
Absolutely. I think we can all relate to that in some way, right? People that we've lost or difficult situations we've been to. But showing compassion is an important part of teaching people, right? And Jesus shows that compassion. I think sometimes we fail to show compassion a lot of times when we should, right? Have you ever thought, yeah, maybe you've kind of went home and you've reconsidered and you thought, I didn't handle that the right way. I should have said this instead of that.
There's a difference in compassion and understanding.
Uh-huh.
Like when
Sure.
somebody goes through something, if you've not been through that, you will never, ever,
No.
ever understand.
But you can still.
You can have compassion
Mhm.
and you can be there.
Absolutely. And compassion, we see it quite often in the miracles of Jesus, the sort of the comforting that's put there as well. Not just, healing, but just any kind of level of compassion, any kind of helping that was done. And the last one, probably the most important one, but the one I kept for last was to produce faith, right? The idea that somebody would say, okay, well, I've seen what this man can do. I know who this man is. I've seen him not only heal people, but I've seen him show love and compassion, as we said there a moment ago, toward people as well. A lot of them were healed absolutely because of their faith. A lot of times, though, we want to put the produce faith at the very top. Well, first of all, you got to have some faith right off the bat. Well, that's not always the truth. You have to give people something to have faith in. And sometimes it takes some of these other things before people can develop faith, right? They didn't immediately all start following Jesus. There wasn't a million people with Jesus on day one. But what about on day 300? What the numbers look like? Gotten a lot bigger, right? Why were they getting bigger? They were spreading the word. They were saying, well, faith comes from what? Hearing. Well, you can't just tell me to have faith in somebody that I've never seen, I've never heard nothing about, I don't know anything about. I can't have faith in that. But if I see it, my faith is going to what? It's going to grow. It's going to build. It's going to increase. Absolutely. But it took a little bit of faith for that to happen. But that purpose of these miracles was to help grow that faith along the way.
And then don't you think, this was all done, and the people, they had to learn this. It was a learning experience for them. They saw it done, and they could believe it or not believe it. I don't care if you not believe it.
Right.
Sure.
Sure.
And which is the same thing with the Bible. Jesus did not force anything else.
Sure.
He did not force people to watch it. He did not force them to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
We all have the Bible where they have the miracles to watch it.
Mm-hmm.
We can believe it not. That's our choice.
Right. Well, and then they had the word of mouth that would take it from point A to point B and point C. All right. So a lot of times I wanted us to look at this because I wanted us to refresh ourselves and review a little bit about the purpose of the miracles and the characteristics of them. And all these are things that we've talked about. But I also wanted to finish with a cessation of miracles. And a cessation, used the word cease there, just stops. Okay. And so why is it that Jesus was a miracle worker, if we want to use that word, but there's no Jesuses, there's no none of that today? Well, I want to look at a few things to start with. Let's start first with 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8 through 11. And you can see here on the side, miracles, including healings and speaking in tongues, have ceased today. But I say that because of what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8 through 11. Linda Denham, do you care to read what's up there on the screen for us, please? Jesus had to grow from child to maturity. The apostles had to grow from childlike to maturity. The church had to grow from child to maturity. Everything had to grow, but there could be no reverting back. And so when we read this, what Paul writes, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, whether there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. He said, all this stuff is happening, but it's going to go away. And what's going to be the remnant? What's going to be left? What do you see in the first sentence up there? What would be left? Love. And so the church had to grow from its immature youth through things like prophecy, tongues, miracles. But once the church grows, do you need those things anymore? No. Now you've got what? You've got the scripture. You've got the spirit. You've got this stuff that you can grow from. It's just like you're a child. They start out here, and you want to get them to there. But there's going to be some growing pains along the way, right? But you can't slap that big steak in front of the 1-year-old and say, gnaw on it, brother, here it is. We can't do that, right? We got to start with something that'll help them understand how to eat. Kids got to learn how to eat, what I can eat. And all of a sudden you're up to here, right? And now we can give you a little something, and then we're going to get you up to here. Well, that's what the church was, right? The church started here. What was the church the first day of the church? You ever thought about that? How do you do church on the first day of church? First day I taught school, they told me, they said, everything you learned in college, forget all that. Now get up there and do it, right? Well, you can almost guarantee that the first time those apostles preached or taught, it's like, well, I didn't expect them to do that, you know? Well, it's growing pains, right? But the church is going to grow. But if the church still needs miracles, if the church still needs tongues, you're not growing, right? It's not growing. So it had to grow into the next level. Number 2, when the gospel was fully revealed, all miracles were to cease. This is Ephesians 4:11 through 13. Lucille, do you care to read that?
And he gave some apostles, some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. Till we all come to the year of faith, and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ.
So Paul's saying here to the people at Ephesus is that he gave some to do different jobs, right? And so that job, whether it be the apostle or the prophet, the evangelist, the pastor, teacher, whatever it was, that job was to help the church do what? That job was to help the church to grow. And once the church had grown, then it had all been revealed, right? That's what, then we know what it is. And so once you're growing, like we said, we don't have to go back to this. But it was going to take the work of a lot of people. And if you read that, some had to be apostles. Jesus called them, right? But there were some that needed to be prophets. And there were some that needed to be evangelists or teachers. And there were some that needed to be pastors. Those were the bishops. Those were the elders of the church. Because when those apostles went on, somebody had to run the shop while they were out, right? And it saved some to be teachers. We talked about that in here on Sunday, right? The importance of teachers. Why is teachers so important? To mold and lead, to grow the future, to push the next level through. And so there's no need for miracles because now we've got an established sort of entity here that people are carrying the load themselves. You don't have to have Jesus being the only one sort of carrying things. Let's go to the third thing here. This is Jude. It's only one chapter in Jude. I have a hard time writing Jude 3. I don't know. It doesn't look right to me. So I write Jude 1, verse 3, but there's only one chapter. But the gospel has been fully revealed. Jude 1 and verse 3. Maria, do you care to read that? So when we look at this verse right here, he says that he was writing about our common salvation. What does the word common there mean? Everyday or ordinary, but I think more here it's what we share, right? It's what we would have in common with one another. And the salvation is different for me than you, the same for me and you. Why does it need to be the same for me and you? It would be unfair. It might not be better or worse, but if it's different, it's going to be unfair, right? And so he says about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith. Meaning, what do we have to do as Christians? He was saying it in Jude 1 and verse 3, but what do we have to do? How do we contend earnestly for the faith? We strive to. There's no miracle there to sort of push us forward. It's now requiring work on our part. Let's go back to the kid just a minute ago. When he was a baby, you fed him. When he was right here, you helped him. But eventually, he's got to eat on his own. And a Christian's got to follow that same path. But to contend earnestly for the faith. And it says there, which was once for all delivered to us. No more delivering. Okay. Now we're preaching and teaching. I don't mean that, but there's no more Jesus is riding in to, that's gone. Now it's in our hands. Is it important for us?
And I think it's important for us not to be looking for something else.
Yeah.
Saturday revelation or something like that, because that is not something Jesus' word says that. And if you don't believe that, I think you are blaspheming the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit had the Bible written. Men wrote the Bible with the Holy Spirit written. And the Bible says you cannot be forgiven for blaspheming the Holy Spirit unless you repent and turn from that. And I think sometimes people that say, well, we're looking for something else. You're saying, well, Jesus said this, God said it, but later on he's going to tell us more. He's told me because I'm kind of special.
Sure.
And that's blaspheming the Holy Spirit. And we've got to do that.
So, questions before we go home. I don't know how to explain the miracles. I don't know how to explain things that happen today that seem unusual, that seem out of character, that seem paradoxical, if we want to use that word. I don't know how to explain it. I'm also not sure that I need to explain it. Because if I spend all of my time trying to explain what happened, I've wasted a lot of time that I could have spent reveling and glorying in what took place. And I think we have to be careful when we try to explain things that happen. I don't know that that's a fitting answer for you. I don't know why a person has some kind of disease and they get better. I don't know why they get a disease in the first place. I don't know. But sometimes we're looking so hard for an explanation that we don't use what we have and enjoy what it is that we have. And that's my thought on the miracles. I told you at the start that it would be really difficult to explain what happened. And I think it still is difficult for us to explain. But we are one person in a world of 8 billion. We are one dot on a very large globe. I hesitate to say we're not important. That's not true. But sometimes we get wrapped up thinking that it all has to make sense to me. And there's 8 billion other people that are trying to make it make sense to them as well. The character of Jesus is filled with mercy, with compassion, and generosity. And our character needs to be filled the same way. Mercy, compassion, and generosity. Jesus used his power to heal, to comfort, and to encourage. We don't have a lot of power, but the power that we have should be to try and help heal people, to try and help comfort people, and to encourage them rather than to smite them down, rather to dominate them, rather to humiliate them. A lot of people with perceived authority like those last three words. But Jesus used the first three, and he had all the authority in the world. Jesus' miracles should teach us, and hopefully they have, to both fear him. The Bible says to fear God and keep his commandments, right? But also to trust him, right? We can fear pretty easy, but why do we struggle with trust? Faith is weak. But we struggle with trust because everybody that we've ever had to trust will in some way or shape or form let us down, right? Who doesn't? Jesus never did. So whatever our trust level is for our fellow man, let's make sure that our trust level for Jesus may be a little higher. And hopefully we've learned a little something in the process of all this here as well. So I hope you've enjoyed these lessons. I hope it's been beneficial to you. I know I wanted to give you like a little test or something and ask which one did you like best, but I thought that would be disparaging to the ones that didn't get picked. So I decided not to do that. But hopefully you have enjoyed it. Yes.
I'm just going to say, 2 Corinthians 5 says, if we walk by faith, not by sight. That's type of your lesson. But then verse 8, by the time we leave it out, we're confident, yes, we are well pleased rather to be absent from the body and be present with the Lord. I'm not looking for a miracle to save my life and to give me 10 more years. Okay?
Right.
I'm going to pray to God to make me better when I get sick. I'm not saying that, okay? But we are well pleased to be with God. If
Right.
we're going to heaven, don't you think we should show it? I'm going to heaven. Well, I'm just 67. I don't know. Might be 97.
Right.
The age doesn't matter. I am going to heaven. Why? Because Jesus was.
Right.
Jesus died. And that's, I don't need a miracle to
Right.
make me live 6 more weeks. I need to go to heaven and be with Jesus.
And Paul said what? For if he was going to live, it'd be what?
Live is Christ.
Uh-huh.
Die is gain.
And to die would be gain, right? And so that's sometimes difficult for us to even have that perspective as well. And I think part of that goes back to the trust that we had also. So any questions or anything before we're finished? Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I've looked. It seems like, how long's it been? A year? I don't know if it's been a year or yet or not. I don't remember when we started. I didn't write it down. I'm guessing it was sometime back January or February. It's been a while, but it's been enjoyable. I have never really studied miracles. Honestly, it seems like most of the conversations we had with miracles were stories in Sunday school or something like that. I hope that it's been beneficial for you, and hopefully you've gained something from it along the way as well. I don't really have anything to say.